Well, hello everyone. Today we're recording again with our first guest for this season. We don't have seasons basically, but like let's put it like this. And it's directly from it's San Diego, isn't it? In the
Yes,
what's the state?
California.
California. We have Dave Hart, or as we like to call him, PD, which stands for Pastor Dave, isn't it?
Pastor Dave. That was what
Yeah.
people called me for years.
So with PD we met through Asylum in London. So we both part uh, of their online gatherings. So this is where we met, and kind of as we got to talk, I found out that PD is I don't know, is the boomer generation of Christian metal.
Sort of. I was older than the generation, but
Well, you're older than a baby boomer.
uh, yeah, I'm old. I went to school with Moses, so I go pretty far back.
Before 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 metal, it was I was.
Yes, well, in those days, I was more athletic. I was on the swim team with Moses. We did quite well, and that sort of thing.
He learned to split the waters.
Yeah, that was a great little trick he did. Actually, we lettered in both track and swimming just for one activity. We ran through the oasis, and it was pretty cool. Anyway, don't worry about these jokes.
So PD actually is, jokes aside, he's one of the very first people that had envisioned to bridge that gap between Jesus and the metal community. And later he did a lot of work with goths, which this is a part I'm really interested to talk about. That we're gonna record 2 episodes today, so to talk about the ghost for the next episode. But for this episode, we're gonna talk about, to hear about you and your story and how this thing, like, this vision grew in you, and some, gonna hear some stories about people, and also gonna, I think you have some stories for Sanctuary with Pastor Bob Beeman, with another pioneer of the heavy metal ministries. Where so pretty much we are your grandchildren, isn't it?
It's yeah, it is. Well, actually, I consider I had a guy approach me who had started doing rave ministry, and I considered that my grandson's uh, kind of thing. But uh, it was a typical middle class American uh, type of Christian, but never quite typical. Actually, I was born in Munich, Germany. So, for your European audiences, uh, I'm legitimately European in that sense. I was born of German parents, part of the post-war baby boom, and this would be World War II for you 20-somethings who don't have a good grasp of
Not the
history.
Great War.
No, the Great War would have been World War One. Yeah, the and put in a Catholic orphanage outside of Munich. My dad was career Air Force, and he and my mom were stationed in well, my adopted dad, and he and my adopted mother were stationed outside of Munich in Germany in the late 40s and early 50s, and for about 3 years, I guess. And they adopted me out of this orphanage, and they adopted my sister uh, from a farm that had to give her up for adoption because they were so poor. And so my parents took me and my sister back to America.
So your
And
sister is not a biological sister, is
not a biological sister, but she's also German. And so my mother was a Schmidt, and my father was a Kleinert, and that's about as German as you could get. And my German goth friends all think it's hilarious because my birth name was Harold Schmidt, who apparently is a famous comedian in Germany, and they just think it's funny that I was named after Harold Schmidt. Um, but um, and I lived on Air Force bases in kind of a middle class, almost suburban type of mentality, and I went to some churches when I was a kid, but I went like a lot of junior high, high school kids. I just went to be with my friends. Um, I'm not sure how much sunk in, although I'm sure it got me thinking about things. Became a Christian through uh, conversations with a friend from Campus Crusade for Christ, which was a huge movement in the 60s. Um, and This would have been 1970 or so. And when I was a sophomore in college. And I got very serious about my faith because it was a fairly conservative evangelical thing. Got me reading the Bible, it got me doing all this stuff. Um, Graduated college at the tail end of Vietnam and ended up getting drafted. Was going to be drafted, so I enlisted in the Navy. So I'm technically Vietnam era Navy veteran, and but I never saw combat. I got into the counseling field through the Navy, drug and alcohol counseling. My father was in the AA program for 60 years. He was
So
an AA
you
saint.
got trained as a counselor in the
I
Navy.
got trained as a drug and alcohol counselor in the Navy to deal with that, and I worked for uh, a program in the Navy that was an in-house counseling things for drug addicts and that within the Navy.
This is interesting. I think it's because, correct me if I'm wrong, back then still things like PTSD were kind of frowned upon, isn't it?
Well, it was not so much frowned upon. It was, we didn't understand it much, but I was doing retreats with Navy chaplains for guys who came back from Vietnam addicted, alcoholics, other drugs. And yeah, there was some PTSD involved, part of uh, their reason for becoming addicted and trying to deal with that. But we weren't even calling it PTSD at that time. It was
It
still
was
shell shock
it was some
and some of
cell
the,
or work hysteria or something, isn't it?
yeah, they had other terms, older terms for it. It didn't officially become PTSD or as a diagnosable thing like that till later uh, in the 80s, really. But I was encountering it and counseling and dealing with it, and it gave me a real interesting foundation in beginning to understand the human condition and all of that. Uh, I And then towards the end of my Navy career, this was a weird part of my is a weird part of my testimony in some ways, but um, I uh, I was really focused on my Christianity, but I had read a book about a guy who basically said that going to seminary was a waste of time. And I kind of bought into the thesis and just kind of dismissed the idea of that kind of thing. But two things happened. One was that I was helping the youth
Sorry,
group.
let me stop you there just to, so for those that don't know what a seminary is, like a Bible college basically. You get,
Right, right.
yeah.
Except it's a postgraduate kind of thing for those of you that understand the thing. My undergraduate degree at the University of Colorado was in political science. Um, so if I wanted to become an ordained minister in a number of the higher churches, Lutherans, Methodists, they like to have you seminary trained. And when I finally did get there, it was I earned a master's degree in Christian education. Um, uh, so the first thing that happened was simply that we got a new head minister, who was just really, really kind of liberal. Um, and uh, my friend and I were both committed Christians, and the guy who had been the youth director had to become the pastor, and then he had to do other things because he was still in seminary and finally graduated and moved on. So they hired a new guy. I don't know why this church hired a guy this liberal, but we did a survey with the kids because we were running the youth group. We were college guys running a high school youth group. I did a survey about with the kids about how they became Christians. And the guy called us in and said, "How dare you ask kids uh, if they're Christians or if they're committed to Christian principles and how much Bible they read? That's none of your business. That's a personal thing, and you should not be challenging kids in the church to talk about Jesus." And I about fell out of my chair, but I didn't have the resources to respond to him. I realized I didn't know, compared to this guy who'd been a minister for ages and had been seminary trained, how to uh, respond to him theologically, doctrinally, any other way. I didn't have the knowledge I needed to combat this concept he was giving me. That was the first thing that made me start thinking about going back to seminary. And the other was I had, in about 6 weeks, I had 3 different people from completely unrelated situations go, "Well, of course, you're going to be a minister, go to seminary and become a minister." And my first thing was, no, I've already dismissed it. There's no way I'm going to let seminary ruin my faith and stuff. And
Why you
and then
believe
somebody
seminary will
else
ruin your
said it.
faith?
And then somebody else said it. And I just said, well, maybe God's trying to tell me something. Because I'd read all these books about what the more liberal seminaries were doing, and their strategy was just to tear down your faith and then let you build it back up again. And I wasn't
I think
going
it's
through
that's
that.
still a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. At
It's
least in more liberal seminaries in the U.S. I
no,
don't know about England.
because like over
So
here, there's no like a. If you go from what most of the denominations, if you go to become a minister, you go to their own specific, which most of it's almost every time is funded, so you kind of.
Well, I was technically sponsored by the Presbyterian Church, but and there was a lot about the Presbyterian Church I liked. And if we really look at history, a lot of the way we structure our government in the United States came from the Presbyterian Church and the way they do things with their committees and their different ways of doing it. But it also is very it's not so much political as it's very egalitarian, that everybody gets to participate in the management of the church in the Presbyterian Church, the way they organize committees and things like that. And they kind of took that approach in organizing the U.S. government. We're arguing about those points these days, but that's what the original constitutional guys kind of had in mind in the way that they organized the Senate. And a balance of power and all these different things was very much inspired by the way the Presbyterian Church was organized. At any rate, I did go to seminary. I went to the most conservative, probably one of the 3 most conservative seminaries, may these days be the only truly conservative seminary. And by conservative, I don't mean necessarily Bible bashing, although a lot of Baptists went to that church. The conservative part was that they believe in complete inerrancy, that every word of the Bible is inspired and by God directly and not to be challenged. I went to a conservative seminary deliberately because I've always realized that it's much easier to tear down than to build up. And I figured even if I got too conservative and needed to loosen up a little bit, it would always be easier to loosen up than to be completely ripped apart and try to rebuild.
I
So,
mean, I think both of is part of the process. Because we a lot of times we think like for us that we have deconstruct quite a lot. This kind of you have to deconstruct and then reconstruct. You can't just like remain with the ruins, isn't it?
well, well, I did some reconstructing, but it was because uh, my time at seminary showed me things that I didn't know before, and I had constructed certain things out of ignorance and agreed. I never, um, I took the complete inerrancy with a grain of salt, even during that kind of thing, and had some arguments with my pastor. The interesting thing was I got uh, a low grade on a paper uh, over this book that talks about near inerrancy, but not complete inerrancy. And we were supposed to debate the book, and I agreed with the book. Uh, and I got yelled at a professor for not understanding the assignment and not defending inerrancy and all of this, uh, which was very frustrating for me. But
So they gave you a book, and it must you had to attack the book basically.
yeah, attacked the book because it didn't go far enough in inerrancy and stuff. The irony of this one was um, I came back the next year to my seminary classes to find out that guy had been fired because he was having an affair with the church secretary and
You know
ran
what's
off
funny?
with her.
Why most of the times this is the case? So people that are so super conservative, they ended up in sexual, either sexual scandal or affairs or like it's always
Yeah,
something sexual. Like
I just thought maybe God was, you know, helping me validate my conclusions by saying you don't necessarily have to believe all these guys. Just keep following me, and
yeah.
uh, we'll get where you need to be. And that became true. That happened to me a number of times in my thing. At that point, I only wanted to be a youth worker, and I just wanted to deal with kids, help kids grow up, and kids in music seemed to be the natural match
So
for
you're
every.
always like into rock and roll and
Yeah,
hard
I
rock.
yeah, but
Because
I
back then
was
metal was still
particularly
not a
by
thing,
that
is it?
time I was really getting enthusiastic about the Christian music scene, um, all the way from Larry Norman, and I mean I was around in the days uh, when Calvary Chapel first started up in Newport Beach with all of the Maranatha music that had started, the early groups like Sweet Comfort and Debbie and Ernie and all these groups that they were recording, and had a chance to go to Calvary Chapel, which is, the whole Maranatha thing, when it was still in a tent before Chuck Smith built it into a big thing. And the irony of that is that Sanctuary was often called the Calvary of the 80s. And Bob and I, neither one of us wanted that
Yeah,
appellation. We
I think
didn't,
in general it's a bad thing. Is why you want to call something new that was like that? It's
yeah,
just people say you're the new Elvis. Or like why you need to be the new Elvis? Like just
yeah,
be you.
just,
Like
just be you. Exactly. But the other issue was that Bob and I both realized, we'll get to that part, but the Sanctuary really is actually more of a mission group in a lot of ways because we went after a particular subculture. We weren't trying to build a denomination, and Bob and I have always said we were certainly not trying to build an empire. And there was just too much work from my standpoint to try to build an empire. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to build Christ into kids' lives. I didn't need to. I wasn't worried about building an
so
empire.
you're never like me that I always want to be a cult leader.
I, I had problems with the institutional church from almost the beginning of my exploration of these things. And Sanctuary, my version, Sanctuary, was a lot about things I didn't want us to become based on examples of what had gone before us in
Uh,
church history.
we start talking about sanctuary, but you and I, we know what it is. But can you,
Yeah.
for the listeners' sake,
Well, that became the thing. My youth and me, I did some youth work, but I got tired of babysitting uh, upper middle class kids and taking them to Disneyland all the time when I was in Los Angeles doing youth ministry. When I went to San Diego, I wanted to do something different, but my involvement in the Christian music scene became pretty intense, and I started promoting Christian concerts in San Diego, and I worked with everybody. Uh, I did a couple of shows with Randy Stonehill. I did a conference debate with Larry Norman about early Christian music things at a Christian music festival. I met all these people and I started working with them in Second Chapter of Acts and all these groups, and a lot of them were great. Uh, and then because I was into the youth, I kept moving more and more to the rock and roll thing, and then got involved and invested with Petra for a while, and became friends with them, and ultimately Stryper came out and in the 80s, and Jimmy Swaggart just hated them, and then and just begged on them all the time, and then he turned out to be having affairs and stuff like that, and I'm just going, I can't. Somebody needs to defend all these kids from all of this stuff and all of these people. I ended up doing 3 shows in San Diego with Stryper, their first 3 album tours back in 86, 85, and 86. And all of a sudden, I turned around and I had kids knocking on my door wanting to talk about this stuff. And I found myself with a living room full of bikers and heavy metal kids. Asking questions about God and Stryper, and are they really Christians, and are there other bands we could find?
so were those people Christian already, or they were just seeking?
I'm sorry.
Those people that were tearing up in your living room, were they Christian already, or they were
Some of
just
them
sick?
were. Some of them were church kids who were being yelled at by their parents for listening to that music, but they really liked the rock and roll side of things. And some of them were people that gotten kicked out of church because their hair was too long. All those really superficial
Yeah.
things that were going on with youth. And we called ourselves the Rock and Roll Refuge. We became a little refuge for kids. So I would say over half of our kids had at least been raised in the church. You know, how serious their affiliation with Christ was kind of on an individual basis, but they've been exposed to Christianity, but they've been exposed to institutional Christianity, and they just wanted to rock and roll and rock out with Jesus. And it was so similar to the period I spent with the hippies back in the 60s when I first became a Christian. Um, I My first church, if you will, was a home church thing with this guy that uh, was mostly filled with hippies off the hill uh, who were becoming part of this new Jesus movement. So I was exposed to all of that, but in Colorado, not in California initially, when I was going to regular college. And I just saw this as a sort of a recycling. You got this new generation of long-haired kids who are anti-institutional, but they love their rock and roll, and I got Christian music I can feed them and help clear their vision about some of those kind of things. So that's what we did. We sponsored Christian rock and roll concerts. The first group we worked with was Bloodgood, and
It's still going. Blood gets it's still going, isn't it?
yes, Bloodgood. Well, Michael Bloodgood, who the band was named after, um, passed away.
It was the
Uh,
drummer, isn't it?
what? Michael?
He passed away like recently, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, last year sometime. It's been pretty recent. But the singer and co-leader of the band, Les Carlson, and his wife were still carrying on the name of Bloodgood in a number of different ways and stuff. But Les and Michael were one of the first Christian band guys that I worked with, and since I already knew how to promote concerts, I would help these young Christian bands come through, and we did things in the park, and we did all these different things, and they were always received really well because we didn't have an age limit, and we weren't a club, so we do things out in the park, and all the junior high skater guys, the middle school skater guys, would come to the concert because they couldn't hear this stuff in the clubs. But here there
Because of
was
the alcohol, isn't
Christian
it?
bands doing this hard rock and this metal and this thrash, and all these skater kids and all these kids were coming because they couldn't get into the clubs, but they could hear their music in the park. And we had a great, outreach time with this kind of thing. But I started this, like I said, as the Rock and Roll Refuge, and it was kind of subtitled A Sanctuary for rockers, and then and that's what we officially called ourselves when we started forming it as a church. Then about 6 months later, I heard this was going on in LA too, and I thought, well, that's interesting. There's another church doing this metal thing. We should get to know these guys so we can meet the other.
So you named yourself Sanctuary without knowing it by accident.
Yeah. Well, we actually reversed it. I called mine the Rock and Roll Refuge, and the Sanctuary was sort of the explanation subtitle.
Okay.
Bob called his Sanctuary and called his subtitle A Rock and Roll Refuge. And we switched ours around after we got associated with Bob. But I went up and had some long talks with Bob. I brought my kids up to their church a couple of times, and then I had a discussion with my group and said, what do you think of associating with this church? And I didn't think they'd want to do it because metalheads were kind of independent, or maybe I was over projecting my own independence, but I wasn't sure they wanted to join another group because that was starting to be too much like becoming or joining a denomination. And I thought they might rebel against that, but they thought Bob was really cool, which he was. They thought that it would be cool to have that association and connections with another group that were also doing a lot of Christian rock and roll concerts. So we started going back and forth to all the shows they were putting on. They would sometimes come down and participate in the show we were putting on, and we became an associate. We became an official sanctuary of San Diego. And I'm the only one that did this independently because all the other sanctuaries that were started in Apple Valley and one other one in LA and in Hollywood, and there was one in Oklahoma. They had all been sort of gone through their Bible school experience through Bob. Bob had his own intense studies, he called it, and all. So
then guys, you became one organization.
Yeah, yeah, and so they were all part of his intense studies. I kind of was the outlier, but since I was already seminary trained, it wasn't a problem for Bob, so we just started little sanctuaries all over the place. Eventually, of course, Bob moved to the East Coast, got out of Los Angeles and moved to the East Coast, and that kind of left me the only one. But by the time he moved, I had already started to move towards the Gothic music. Heavy metal had changed in America, kind of disappeared in certain ways as a major thing. The glam movement was certainly over, and all the stuff that was really visible about heavy metal kind of faded back into the underground.
Because grunge was like then the thing, isn't it? Actually, grunge was the one that killed
grunge
hair metal,
kind of
isn't it?
Became a different thing. It attracted a lot of metalheads, but it wasn't exactly metal. It was its own. It was a little bit different of a subculture.
I mean, grunge came out of punk mainly.
Right. So. And I spent 5 years after I, I did Heavy Metal Sanctuary for about 12 years, and I spent about 5 years with the punkers. And then I ended up, which we'll talk about later, 15 years hanging in the goth
Yeah,
clubs.
because I remember, I mean, as a metalhead kid, I was listening. I was listening. I mean, I was really into Nirvana. So it was like, as a metalhead, it was like listening to Nirvana. It's like, or even if you listen to punk, because I was really into Offspring. I'm still really into Offspring, but like those, there was their early days. So it's still like kind of, there's still a lot of like hostility with punk, and so now I think things are a lot more like relaxed, and
Well, and even that changed.
we got assimilated because of, with the society. So
The
uh,
older dead Kennedys, Black Flag type of groups got replaced by all this pop punk and
yeah.
MXPX
But also, I
and
think
Green
he
Day and
also had
stuff.
like, when he had Jeff Hanneman going on stage with a Dead Kennedy guitar for it, so it kind of like start breaking that barrier. And I mean, I guess if you're into thrash, inevitably you were into punk as well, because like thrash was, half punk, is it? Uh, but so that's what you're saying with the metal. Like, people lost interest with metal in the states.
Uh, I don't know. The whole thing changed. And grunge was part of it, and then Marilyn Manson came along. So the metal thing was, and Metallica put out a couple of really bad albums, and nobody wanted to unload and reload, and nobody wanted to associate with them anymore and stuff. They got good again, but
You're opening a big conversation.
yeah, I know.
I
Axel,
had my
uh,
best mate. He came in. He started. He his his gateway to into metal was load and reload, and still like we consider him like, you you're not worthy.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, and stuff. I don't
We
know.
got into metal like with like Iron Maiden, like every most teenagers during the 80s, 90s, like Priest and Maiden and Metallica, the pre-Black Album Metallica, uh, yeah, all those like classic bands, and then like,
Well, that's it. If you're
Obituary.
a Metallica purist, you prefer their speed metal stuff before
I
they
don't think
they
I think
went
Metallica
MTV.
purist. I don't think they like anything after the Kill 'Em All.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was once they went MTV, a lot of people thought they sold out. Uh,
I think
and
some people say like after the Drain, all the song Mustaine and Burton wrote, they start writing bad records. That's what the purists say basically. Like when,
yeah,
because I think
well,
Mustaine is not great credited enough in within Metallica.
well, the problem was they kicked him out because he was too crazy. How you can be too crazy for a speed metal teenage speed metal band like that, I don't know.
To the
But they
80s.
he
Because
was
they all screw ups, isn't it? They all like super
yeah.
alcoholic, super, and then like Mustaine managed to go even further than this. Like, is beyond.
Well, and the drummer remained an alcoholic for, as far as I'm concerned, all through the whole thing. From my drug and alcohol background, I picked up on this. But Hetfield was the one who earned um, um, my respect, and it's because of his writing. Um, you don't have to listen to the music. You pull out the lyric sheet on those albums,
Mm.
and uh, uh, I didn't see a lot of heavy metal guys being able to, especially the early things that predated it, where they started doing these monster albums with three sides and all of this other kind of stuff. Uh, uh, Iron Maiden got real literary and all of this stuff. And Hetfield had this genius for condensing huge ideas into very short phrases of poetry,
Mm.
and it was brilliant. It was just
From
brilliant
an
writing.
interview of his I saw, he was channeling a lot of his pain through his dad leaving, his mom's death. So well, most of his songs are about his
Yeah, death.
growing up and his family situation, because he was like a Christian Christian Scientist. So his mom basically died because she refused to go to the doctors, but then she just.
And
And then he was blaming his father for his mom's death.
well, that was the ludicrous part from the church going, but there's Satanists. I'm going, he's not. There's nothing in classical Satanism in this stuff. His focus is death. He's dealing with death in almost every song, and that was his theme. And I'm sure it helped some other people deal with death in that respect. But Hetfield, I had a lot of respect for. Lars was just, I don't know. He was becoming more and more brain dead with every interview because of how much alcohol he drank. So my whole
I mean,
focus was on
at the end,
Hetfield.
he learned to play the drums properly. Uh, so you have the Metallica purist now jumping.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
joke, like, you know.
yeah.
Well,
It's
it is recorded that Hetfield actually didn't want to do a band with Ulrich because his drum kit was like childish, basically, and then he couldn't find anyone else, so he just settled with Lars.
yeah.
That's recorded history. We're not making this.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. For my money, Hetfield was the talent in the band, the most talented in the band, and he's what made the band valid, as far as I'm
I think
concerned.
if Mustaine he wasn't so wasted and Berdon didn't die, I think Metallica would be like 100 times better band that they are now. I think because you see what Burton used to play back in like he was like 23 or something. He was playing crazy stuff. That's why he would be playing like after like 30 years of practice on those insane solos. Like.
Yeah. Uh, Megadeth came into their own eventually, uh, and ironically for our crowd, Mustaine ultimately became a Christian and has been hanging around with Alice Cooper and other
He's a
Christian
bit he's a
rockers.
bit he's a bit like conservative though, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah, because I
it's
remember
one of
when
those things.
they were playing in Greece, and the promoter arranged to have Rotting Christ as a support band, and Mustaine actually intervened and kicked them out, which was sad because he had that amazing opportunity to, you know, I mean, Rotting Christ are total weirdos, but kind of, you know, you wasted a fantastic opportunity to, you know, be Jesus' light to an
That
atheist because Rotting Christ they're not Satanists, but and they wrote some very good songs. I mean, I'm not into black metal, but the last few years they moved away from this anti-church, anti-Christians, and they have some really good songs. It's just the name is like because you know when you start a black metal band where you're like 18, you know you're gonna have to go like as offensive as you can go. Like,
yeah, um, yeah. We and it's always been a contest, and I agree. That's the way Stryper started out. They didn't want to play with Christian bands. They specifically chose uh, other uh, secular bands on their level. When they came to San Diego the third time, they played with Loudness from Japan, and they let me the first two times they let me pick local
mm.
secular bands to open for them because they were just starting out still and didn't have the MTV push yet. Um, they went and signed with Atlantic after I did my last show with them in San Diego. I still was friends with them for a while, but not Atlantic, but that was POD. Um, but anyway, that
I
kind
think
of
that sometimes
contest, though.
Christians will
Uh,
become too sensitive and too afraid. And I think we could see that when Brian Wells returned to Korn. You know, you can see like when a Christian metal band start moving more to indirect lyrics. But That's kind of like, yeah. Because I remember myself like looking Brian Wells return to Korn. It was like, you know what's, in my, I was still like in my conservative times. I was coming out, but it's kind of like, yeah, what he's doing, and but then you realizing what the, what that platform actually, what ways to engage with people open, and
Yeah,
yeah,
he's he's done brilliant with it and been very outspoken and stuff. We talked about the demise and things, but I think the reason some of these guys became Christians was because uh, were not they were not being affected uh, by these other bands and other things in terms of being tempted to be more like them. I think a lot of these guys saw the self-destruction. Probably one of the key examples in the 80s was Guns N' Roses, and how off the charts uh, Axel started getting, and all this stuff about beating up his girlfriend and being so drug paranoid he wouldn't come out for his own concerts, and he became completely self-destructive. And I think just there were a lot of guys starting to see that there had to be another way to do this. There
I
had to
mean, a
be
lot of them
another
start
way to
looking for more meaning, isn't it? And you see now,
absolutely.
even a lot of the older bands, which they went like head first on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're now all, sobriety is the new normal within the metal scene. You talking about Korn, like all of them, they haven't touched alcohol, all four of them, for years, more than 10 years sober, because like
Uh,
they
Ironically,
lost their families, they lost, it was like,
yeah, two couple of the guys in Slayer, you know, done a lot of changes in their lives because of the self destructiveness. I think they just realize I don't want to go out this way, and
yeah.
um, I need to make some changes. And ultimately, uh, started talking to the guys who were making changes, and some of them turned out to be Christians, and there's been a lot of that. But you get older, and the Mustaine is another one that just I think the issue for a lot of guys, uh, even LL Cool J and stuff, once they get married and have kids and take their being a family man seriously, they start reconsidering
Mm.
their youth. I mean, they don't may not apologize for it, but they just go, "Yeah, I'm past that now." LL Cool J used to do interviews all the time
Yeah.
saying, "I would never let my kids listen to my stuff now."
Which one?
LL Cool J, he was a rapper, not a
Ah,
heavy
okay.
metal guy,
I
but
remember Tom Araya.
Mustaine is the same way.
I was watching an interview from Tom Araya, closer to when they kind of decide to kind of wind down Slayer. It's like he was saying, like, I can't do that anymore. Like, and he was saying, like, the early days, like, I wasn't seeing my kids for months. Then, he said, like, when we started making more money between shows, he could fly and see his kids. But, like, I was constantly on the road. It's kind of like what I'm doing. But he couldn't do anything else. You know. And then part of like his decision to stop was like, I want that at least now in this age, at least now, I made some money, I can like wind down and at least enjoy my adult kids and my grandkids. And it's not a life, it's not a life for a family person. You can't have a family uh, while you're doing this, isn't it? Like, it wears you down. Like any job that you're constantly away, isn't it?
Yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
it's like that stereotype of the traveling salesman in American films that they have affairs and they're divorced, and because
yeah.
what's the point of marrying a person and start a family with them if you're not there? Like,
Uh, it just yeah. The truth is, kids change everything, and people some want to start families with the idea that nothing's going to change. They're just going to add happiness to their life, and
mm,
they just go, "No, kids change everything."
Yeah, yeah, I know. But as we kind of think we start winding down this episode,
Sure.
uh, as a
Well,
last thing, I want you to share something. We had this before. I kind of, but you, I think you interviewed him or you kind of met, the guy, the second coolest person after meeting Jesus.
you want me to tell the Lemmy story?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Lemmy was an amazing validation at a number of levels, and it wasn't something I structured. People always say that, but it was totally a God thing. I didn't uh, know it was going to happen. I didn't know. I didn't uh, prepare for it. I didn't engineer it or anything. And of course, a lot of young rockers were always trying to get themselves in a place where they could meet the stars. That was never my objective. Um, uh, with that, in fact, I spent more time introducing kids to Christian musicians than obviously trying to get introduced to secular musicians. But I had a Christian rocker kid who was really into the scene, who attended Sanctuary in San Diego for a while and eventually moved up to Hollywood, up on the Sunset Strip. All of the old clubs, Gazzari's and the Rainbow Club and the Whiskey and all those clubs that Motley Crue and all those guys were playing back in the day in the 80s. And he basically moved up there uh, uh, to either get famous or meet famous people. He was really caught up in that. Um, and about a year after he moved, he called me and said, "I'm getting married. Would you come up and do my wedding um, and stuff? I want to have a rocker pastor do this wedding. We're doing it at Gazzari's. It'll be an off night for Gazzari's, and we'll do it." So, and this story is just a crack up to me. The whole thing every time I think about it. But so he's marrying this beautiful black girl who uh, whose aunts and female relatives all show up to this wedding, and they're like AME, which the American Methodist Episcopal Church is kind of the black side of the upscale black side of the church. These are the ladies you see in the movies who wear uh, like a purple hat with the same blouse and the skirt and the shoes. Everything is monochromatic, but they're all different colors,
They look like
yellows
this
and
in the
reds.
UK as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of enough of
I mean,
the,
they always dress like in the fanciest,
yeah,
colorful on a Sunday. Like they
yeah,
go like
but
they turn into
they all
11.
try to they all wear the same uniform, if you will, but in really bright neon colors, and all of them have a different color. You don't have two people wearing the same color, that all that kind of stuff. And they all showed up like that. So I've got them over on this side. Uh, and then on this side of the aisle, I've got all these rocker kids who all look like they're straight out of Rat and Motley Crue and all of this kind of stuff. Bandanas and torn jeans and the whole thing. And you got these women just to the nines, and these guys just uh, Skid Row, the whole look. And stuff. It was really funny, and I just thought, yeah, it's an interesting contrast because I knew those are the kind of guys that Victor hung out with, and stuff. Well, out come the guys uh, for the beginning of the wedding, and lo and behold, and I had to do a double take. Lo and behold, his best man is Lemmy Killmister from Motorhead. And I can't, I mean, he went up there to make friends with guys like this, and apparently he did. Apparently, Lemmy agreed to be his best man. And uh, basically, Victor never got any farther than being a roadie for a Doors cover band. But as far as his own musical aspirations, but he was very happy meeting all these famous people, and he became friends with Lemmy. So we did the wedding, and then right before the wedding starts, we've got this small little mic stand set up, and the bride and the groom in front of me, and one of the aunts of this young lady comes up and moves the microphone and puts it in front of the bride. And because they just are looking at everything going on and going, this is not a serious wedding. These guys are not taking this seriously. But if anything, we're going to hear from the bride and stuff. And I went back and said, no, I've got the book. I'm doing the talking. I'm the minister here. You wouldn't do this to your own minister. So please don't, presume that I'm not a real minister either. And then I took the microphone back, and I looked over at all the guys sitting on the Motley Crue side there and stuff, and I jacked up the mic and turned it down like that and went, "Dearly beloved," like this. They all started falling out of their chairs. But it was my signaling to Lemmy that, and I knew Victor had talked to him about me and stuff simply because of the way the wedding got arranged, but and told him I was a heavy metal pastor. So I wanted to be legitimate, kind of thing, and that was the quickest, easiest, funnest way I could be legitimate. The women on this side are.
But I think like having Lemmy in the room, you want to impress him, isn't it?
Yeah, I did want to impress him. I want him to know that I knew and stuff, that I wasn't some poser kind of thing. But the women in this side were like all stone-faced gargoyles. They didn't get it. They did not understand the humor. And these guys are falling off their chairs. We went ahead. We did the wedding. Victor came up to me and goes, Lemmy wants to talk to you. He's got his own back room at Gazzari's. He's Lemmy. Of course he's got his own back room and stuff. And that he could control the flow of his fans.
Because you don't want the fans to, ruin the wedding, is it?
That's true too. So he's going back there and he goes, Lemmy would like to talk to you back in his room, just you and him. He's fascinated with his idea of a heavy metal pastor. Never heard of such a thing. He's not sure what that means and what it is. And I said, I'll go back and talk to him. So I went back there and I spent about 20, 30 minutes with Lemmy, just him and me, having a beer, talking about Ozzy peeing on the Alamo, all the kinds of inside rock and roll things that were going on. But I got to a shift in the conversation where I didn't do it confrontationally. I did it as an honest question. I'm going, you have a reputation for hating the church and Christians and all of those things associated with it. And I said, why did you come to this place where you hate all things Christian? And he goes, it's not that exactly, but it turns out his father was a Reformed minister.
He was an Anglican priest that he left them for the younger woman, and he never saw him. I think there's a record that they met when Lemmy was in his 30s or something and it didn't go very well.
Well, Lemmy's side of the story was a little bit different. He's going, look, my dad was a minister in a church that didn't permit divorce, and my mother divorced him, and they drummed him out of the ministry. And he goes, it crushed my father. It was the one thing he loved. It was the one thing he did well, and it just crushed him. And I've resented the church ever since. And it was an interesting side of, at least that's his interpretation of the thing. And I haven't done enough research to validate it, but I'm talking to Lemmy, and he's being very confessional. I mean, he was a perfect gentleman during the whole thing. He wasn't swearing. He wasn't try to be rude. He didn't try to challenge me or tell me that Christianity was stupid. We didn't get into a theological debate.
Now you're saying he wasn't swearing, and I kind of going back to any interviews I have seen of him. Now you said he wasn't swearing at all.
No, when he was off stage, he was like this English gentleman. As himself, he was just really mild-mannered. He was polite. He was deferential to me. He wasn't trying to attack me during. And from what I heard,
he was always very, very low tone. Is that he was having a a one-bedroom flat and around the corner
Yeah,
from his pub, and that was he's doing all day. Just wake up, go to the pub.
yeah. My orientation with him was that he really had more of a biker mentality than some of this newer things. He certainly was not Glenn Benton from Deicide. He wasn't that kind of. Uh, he didn't ever portray that kind of arrogance either to me. So I took him at his word for that story and explained to him that I understand. And I told him I have a lot of things I'm frustrated with the church about, and it's why I do my ministry in this more independent way. But I just want you to consider separating um, believing your your experience with the church and recognizing that God is a separate entity. The church is not God, and uh, you have an opportunity to get into a relationship with the person of God without having to put up with all of the institutional and hypocrisy and the things there is. Yes, there's a lot of it, but there are real believers too. But the real believers are the ones who believe in God, not in the church. And if you can separate that, you might be able to, uh, uh, reconcile moving in a more spiritual direction for yourself. And he considered that really well.
But
The
also, I
topic
think he
is
was a very traumatized person. Is the take like his addiction to speed and alcohol. I think I think deep down he said like I think he had his own personal demons.
I'm sure he did. And if we talked more, some of that would have come out. He seemed to be able to trust me with his personal side. And he realized I was a heavy metal pastor in the sense of how we talked about rock and roll, what my background was, and why I was doing it. And I asked Victor a little tenuously a little bit later after I left and stuff, and everybody was still talking and running around from the wedding and stuff. And I said, "Well, how did it go? Did he uh, did I do okay, or did he think I was a complete hypocrite and all this stuff?" And Victor looked at me dead faced and said, uh, "Well, basically, what he told me was you're the only Christian he ever met that he talked to a second time." And I went, "Wow." But I didn't take that from an arrogant standpoint. I know that's going to sound like an arrogant kind of thing. What I took it was God's validation that I was in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, that I had a particular point of view and approach to this whole kind of thing that was completely valid. People were responding, not because uh, I was trying to be a big rock and roll star. People were responding because I was authentic
I
in
think
my
I think it's something we were
Christianity.
talking about one of the asylum meetings. That about authenticity is that uh,
Yeah.
you know. And I remember listening that for a few years ago from some, I don't remember his name, but he was basically saying that the greatest apologetic that we can have as Christians is our own authenticity. And what I think many don't understand is like people can feel when we're not authentic. Not as Christians, like every people, like call it energy, call it like the spirit, call it like the vibes that we give to people. It's kind of they always get it. If you're not authentic, people will get it. They will feel uncomfortable. Might not able to pin it down, but they will feel like that something is not right,
And I
isn't
do
it?
think they sense it. And that was a major part of my success in being in the Gothic thing as well as the heavy metal thing. I was challenged by punks. I've been threatened by Satanists and all of that. But the authenticity keeps coming through, and kids somehow sense that. It's more important to me as I get older as well, to to carry on with that authenticity. Let me get one little scriptural dynamic in here and stuff that is a foundational part of my philosophy, and
Yeah,
that's simply,
and we can close this episode
yeah,
with
close it with
this.
this. Um, what we're called to, uh, obviously, is to resent Jesus Christ, but uh, the way in which we do it, I model more on the Holy Spirit, the comforter, the encourager, the educator. But the word for Holy Spirit in the Greek is paraklesis, and it literally means to come alongside. And I think it's part of our problem with the church,
Literally
which
means the advocate.
there's a number of different, but if
I'm Greek.
yeah, I know. But if you do that uh,
Yeah,
and the verb
yeah.
from the
But
klesis,
paraclete was a legal term,
right?
so it was
It's the guy who came into the court situation to represent the
yeah,
defendant,
yeah,
the accused. I mean, yeah,
yeah, the accused.
and
Yeah.
and that's exactly. But I like that part of the translation that represents coming alongside, and because I
Mm.
think it's a shortcoming in the church that we have refused to come alongside the world, uh, the people in the world who need Christ. We
Instead,
won't.
we asking the world to come alongside us.
Yeah, we want them to come up the hill and come to our club, but we don't go down to them. And of course, that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus did, and it's the opposite of what the Holy Spirit
And it was one of
does.
Jesus' judgments to the Pharisees, isn't it?
It, it's anti-Christian to do it that way, and but I get criticized by those people for saying you can't rub elbows with those people. You're going to get sin, and I'm going. That's really horrible theology because that's not how it works. And secondly, if I am going to become Christ-like, which is my goal as a Christian, is to become more and more like Christ, then uh, then behaving like the Holy Spirit and coming alongside these kids and listening and walking with them and coming into their world and experiencing what they experience. Whether it's, I've been doing it since I've been doing youth ministry. I play the video games they did. I read the books they read. I listened to the music they listened to and stuff. So I could come into their world with some kind of credibility and authenticity and understand who they are in their world. And I just believe that's the way this kind of ministry is supposed to be done. And it's completely a scriptural approach.
Mm.
And people want to talk about the cultural dynamics, and they miss the deeper truths of the scripture that say, but this is what we were called to go into
Yes,
all the world
definitely.
and preach the gospel. In fact, that word go into all nations in Matthew 28 should be translated tribes.
Yeah,
And that was my thing. I've been going to youth tribes for most of my life. And these subculture things are a passion of mine
yeah.
because, and I literally got the reputation in Southern California of being the youth guy who talks to the kids that nobody wants to talk to.
Mm. But that was Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah,
He was talking to the prostitutes, to the tax collector, to the lepers,
absolutely. That's my
to the
role
women
model.
with periods, and like every. Yeah. So with this thought, we're gonna close this episode. And so for the first time listeners, that will be the next episode will be in a month's time. But for me and PD will be a few seconds. So we're gonna close for now, say goodbye. And the next one we're gonna be talking about goths and PD's work with the goths in where he is in San Diego. So leave us some comments and remember to follow us wherever you're listening to this or watching. And we'll see you. So the next episode will be Roger and myself talking about something I don't remember. We already recorded it, but yeah. So yeah, that's it for me, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, George.